Stanley Kubrick has always fascinated me, not just because his movies are masterpieces, which they are, but because every story behind the camera sounds like something out of a thriller. The more I read about what it was like to work with him, the more it started to feel less like filmmaking and more like a psychological experiment you didn't sign up for. I mean, the man could make grown actors cry, confuse entire film crews into submission, and somehow convince everyone that 127 takes of the same scene were absolutely necessary. The man was brilliant, no doubt, but behind that genius sat a control freak who once spent months obsessing over how a carpet looked in a hallway. And yet people stuck around, because somehow his madness made magic. In this marvelous video, we're talking about the bizarre, jaw-clenching, borderline absurd facts that explain why Stanley Kubrick was both a genius and an absolute nightmare to work with. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. Now, this is a small click for you, but for us, well, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He forced actors into physical danger for the sake of realism. Kubrick didn't care much for playing it safe. If a scene needed chaos, tension, or fear, he made sure his actors actually felt it physically. Everyone remembers that brutal Ludovico scene in A Clockwork Orange. Alex was strapped to a chair, eyes yanked open with metal clamps, being forced to watch violent clips while Beethoven blasts in the background. It's one of the most uncomfortable things I've sat through. But what most people don't know is how much pain Malcolm McDowell was actually in during that sequence, because it wasn't all acting. Yep, Kubrick wanted that scene to feel real, so he brought in an actual doctor to be on set and manually drip eye solution into McDowell's eyes every 15 seconds to keep them from drying out. It sounds responsible on paper, until it wasn't. Despite all the prep and reassurance, things went awry fast. McDowell's cornea got scratched, and worse, he went temporarily blind. Temporarily, but still blind. And if you're wondering whether the screams Alex lets out during the procedure are genuine, well, yes, they are. McDowell was in actual pain and terrified the whole time. He wasn't pretending to be tortured, he was actually being tortured. But Kubrick, being Kubrick, kept the cameras rolling for his perfect shot. The man was obsessed with realism, no matter the cost. In his mind, if the actor is hurting and scared, well, that means the character is too, and that's what ends up on screen. However, there's no denying the result. It's one of the most iconic moments in film history, locked in forever. But for McDowell, it wasn't a cool story or a career highlight at the time. It was torturous and left him with eye trauma, and no love lost for the director. Then there was the staged beating scene. You'd think it was padded and choreographed for safety. Not really, because McDowell ended up with cracked ribs. And it wasn't only McDowell who got run through the ringer. Adrienne Corey, who played the wife during the home invasion, had to shoot that violent scene over and over, 39 times to be exact. McDowell was the one doing the fake assault, and even he couldn't take it anymore. That was the level of emotional and physical strain on that set. And after going through it all, McDowell figured Kubrick would at least be a friend. After all, they'd made something iconic together. Right? Wrong. Once filming wrapped, Kubrick ghosted him completely. That's the Kubrick way, where pain equals art. Working with Kubrick was never about comfort. It was about surviving the shoot and hoping the pain translated to something unforgettable on screen. Yeah, it usually did. But ask anyone who actually made those movies, and you'll get a very different story. He made Shelley Duvall cry for months until she became hoarse. Shelley Duvall, too, had it pretty rough on the sets of The Shining. What looked like unadulterated panic on the screen, which sure is unforgettable, but it was actually not all acting. Kubrick made sure of that. The shoot was supposed to be wrapped in about 17 weeks. Instead, it dragged on for a full year, and during that year, Duvall went through hell. On set, he'd scream at her, belittle her in front of the crew, and keep her under pressure for months. He isolated her from the rest of the crew, told the crew not to comfort her, not to even talk to her, to get herself in the headspace he wanted. Duvall would pop in sad songs on her Walkman and force Duvall into a pit of anxiety and dread. She was drained, both physically and mentally. Everyone in the cast and crew felt for her, but Stanley Kubrick kept pushing. Then came the famous bat scene. You know, the one where she backs up the stairs while her husband Jack goes full maniac. Duvall had to scream, cry, and swing for days. Kubrick pushed her through take after take of breakdown scenes until she was actually breaking down for real. That single scene took 127 takes. Let me just repeat that. 127. It still holds the record for most takes in a scene with dialogue, and the reason was Kubrick wanted perfection no matter the cost. Duvall begged for breaks, and by the end of it, the toll was obvious. Duvall was hoarse, dehydrated, her hair started falling out from stress, and her hands were raw from holding the bat so tight. Even Jack Nicholson was worried. But Kubrick didn't let up. To him, it was all part of the process, and it worked. Because when you watch her in that scene, she's not pretending to be scared, because she is actually scared. Maybe of another take, I guess. We see her eyes are red, she's trembling, and her voice is weak. It's so effective because what you're seeing isn't performance, it's Duval falling apart for real, which makes you wonder, is it brilliant filmmaking or torture? With Kubrick, it's always a little bit of both. His crew were petrified of him. Imagine being so freaked out by your boss that you'd risk landing on a Pentagon watch list just to keep him happy. That might have actually happened during the making of Dr. Strangelove. Kubrick wanted the inside of the B-52 Stratofortress bomber in his film to look exactly like the real thing. Although there was just one problem. The real bomber's interior was classified. It was top-secret military gear, and nobody knew what it looked like. And safe to say, the US government wasn't handing over blueprints to a movie crew. But Kubrick didn't care about what was allowed. He wanted it. So his team had to get creative. They somehow got hold of a photo of the real B-52 cockpit. Nobody knows how, and nobody's admitting anything. On top of that, they were able to tinker around a B-29 bomber, which had a similar layout. With those two pieces, they Frankensteined a replica of the B-52 cockpit that looked way too close to the real thing. How close, you ask? Well, actual bomber pilots watched the film and said it was spot on. One guy even said it was absolutely correct, down to the tiniest switch. They were especially surprised by the black box, because the film showed it in exactly the same place it was in real life, and that was something classified, which could only mean that either someone got real lucky or got their hands on something they shouldn't have. Kubrick himself started to suspect his team had done something illegal. It was too perfect to be just an imitation. He thought they may have broken into a real B-52, and honestly, he might not have been wrong. Nobody ever confirmed it, but the accuracy was bizarre. And considering how intense Kubrick was, it's not hard to believe the crew would go to those lengths to avoid disappointing him. So maybe no actual laws were broken, or maybe the art department got so deep into Cold War espionage that they accidentally built a cockpit the military would rather they didn't see. Either way, the bomber set in Dr. Strangelove looked real, a little too real. He made Matthew Modine miss the birth of his son. Full Metal Jacket took 2 years to shoot, and not in Vietnam, or even the US, but entirely in London. Stanley Kubrick didn't like to fly, so he brought the war to him. During that marathon of a shoot, lead actor Matthew Modine kept a personal diary, which he later published as Full Metal Jacket Diary. It's filled with crazy entries, but one story about the birth of his son really sticks out. Modine's wife had to undergo an emergency C-section because the baby wasn't growing properly in the womb. It was serious, and so Modine rushed to the set and told Kubrick he needed to leave. After all, he had to be there for his wife. And Kubrick, well, he was kind of douche about it. He brushed it off, told Modine he would faint if he saw blood, and that he would just get in the doctor's way. Not the reaction you'd hope for, but with Kubrick, it is what it is. However, Modine wasn't having it. He kept pushing back, saying he needed to go. Kubrick didn't care and started yelling. So Modine snapped and pulled out a pocket knife and threatened to slice his own hand open, just so he'd be taken to the hospital and forced off set. Yikes. Way to ask for time off. That finally got Kubrick to back off, but even then, his final order was go, but come straight back once it's over. That's the kind of environment Modine was working in, where a literal emergency surgery for your unborn kid needed to be negotiated. Kubrick was laser focused on the film and didn't want anything breaking that rhythm, even real-life crises. And Modine had to fight tooth and nail just to be a father for a day. Well, all's well that ends well, I suppose. He manipulated actors' emotions off camera. Jack Nicholson didn't need much help playing unhinged, but knowing Kubrick, he did meddle with the process. He had full confidence in Nicholson's ability to play Jack Torrance spiraling into madness, but he wanted more than a great performance. And so he did what he had to do, or so he thought. Apparently, Jack Nicholson can't stand cheese sandwiches. Totally hates them, and Kubrick knew this. So Kubrick made sure that's all Jack got to eat for 2 weeks straight just to mess with him. The idea was to build up real-life frustration and irritation, which would leak straight into Nicholson's performance, which it absolutely did. Yeah, it was petty, yeah, but hey, hard to argue with the results. Now, it's not 100% confirmed, but enough people from the production had the same story to tell. And honestly, it sounds about right given Kubrick's reputation. He built Vietnam out of a poisoned gas works. Stanley Kubrick turned a chunk of East London into a war zone. and not in the metaphorical way. For Full Metal Jacket, he transformed the abandoned Baeksan gasworks into the bombed-out city of Hue, Vietnam. And to do that, he demolished buildings, wrecked them with explosives, and entire sections were torn apart with a wrecking ball. The blueprint was a single photograph of Hue from 1969, and that was enough for Kubrick. He wanted it to look exactly how it looked in reality, down to the last piece of rubble. And while the set looked incredible on camera, behind the scenes, it was a total health hazard. Matthew Modine wrote in his diary that the place was an environmental nightmare. The gasworks were full of asbestos, debris, and God knows what else. It was a toxic wasteland, and nobody was walking out of that set feeling healthy. The cast and crew got sick. The air was thick with dust and chemicals, and people were coughing their guts out between takes. But Kubrick hardly noticed because obviously he was locked in on the vision, recreated brick by brick, even if it meant filming in what was basically a biohazard zone. For him, perfection mattered more than comfort or safety. And true, yeah, the shots turned out beautiful in the bleakest way possible, but the crew paid for it with their lungs. Only Kubrick would think of bombing London to film a war across the world. He hired aerospace engineers for a movie set. When Stanley Kubrick set out to make 2001: A Space Odyssey, he wasn't looking to make a cool space movie. Instead, he wanted to build the future from scratch. The film had to look like something light years ahead of its time, even beyond what NASA was pulling off in the real world. Kubrick didn't want audiences to laugh at outdated sets a few years later. He wanted the film to feel like the future was already here. To pull that off, he didn't rely on your standard Hollywood set crew and went all in. He brought in actual aerospace engineers, aeronautics experts and astronomical artists, people who really knew how spacecraft should look and work. The goal was to create a mise-en-scène that looked believable, down to every button, seat, and blinking light. Every shot had to feel like you were on board a real spacecraft. One of the craziest pieces in the film was the spinning centrifuge. At the time, centrifuges were getting a lot of attention from NASA. They were being explored as a possible way to simulate gravity in zero-G environments. Kubrick wanted one, so he got Vickers Engineering Group to build it. It cost him alone $300,000 in 1960s money. The set looked like a giant rotating hamster wheel, and it could actually spin. And it wasn't just the centrifuge. Every inch of that ship, the corridors, the pods, even the cutlery, all felt real. Kubrick's obsession with detail paid off big. The film won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects in 1969, and critics still call it one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made. In fact, the film looked so real that a whole wave of conspiracy theorists swore he'd been hired by the US government to fake the moon landing. Whether or not you believe that part, one thing's for sure, he built a future that felt legit. He demanded hundreds of nearly identical takes, even for minor actions. Every horror fan knows that moment from The Shining. Jack Nicholson hacking through the bathroom door with an axe, face pushing through the splintered wood, crazy eyes, and then, "Here's Johnny!" It's a line that stayed with us forever. But what most people don't know is that the line wasn't in the script. Nicholson pulled it out of nowhere, riffing off The Tonight Show's famous intro. Kubrick had no clue what it meant, but he liked the vibe and kept it in. And we all know how it ends. That scene became one of the scariest moments in horror history, but getting that shot was a task. The props team originally built a flimsy door, thinking Nicholson would need help tearing through it. But as it turns out, Nicholson had trained as a volunteer fire marshal, and he took down the fake door like paper. So they went back, built a thicker, stronger one. Problem solved, they thought, until they realized Kubrick wasn't going to settle for a take or two. That one scene took 3 days to shoot, and the crew ran through close to 60 doors before Kubrick gave it the green light. During Eyes Wide Shut, Kubrick turned something as insanely simple as walking to the door into a chore, because Harvey Keitel, who was originally cast in Eyes Wide Shut, couldn't even make it past a door. One scene had him walking through a room. Simple enough, right? Except Kubrick made him do it 68 times. Keitel reached his breaking point and stormed off, telling Kubrick he was out of his mind. Can't really blame him. Veteran actor Sidney Pollack filled the shoes. But soon he learned the same lesson. Once you stepped onto a Kubrick set, there was no such thing as good enough. There was only again. All Pollack had to do was get up from a chair and walk across the room to answer the door. That's it. Just walk and open the door. Pollack, probably trying to play it safe, asked Kubrick how he should do it. A grave mistake. Kubrick shot back with, "You decide." And that was the beginning of the rabbit hole. What should have taken 5 minutes ended up stretching into 2 days of filming, with Pollack trying every possible variation of standing, walking, pausing, turning the handle, everything. Hundreds of takes. Eventually, Pollack lost it and asked what else he could possibly do with the scene. And Kubrick, well, basically shrugged and said he didn't think it would take this long either. But surely Pollack still wanted to get it right, didn't he? Tom Cruise had a similar experience on the film. He was instructed to open the door. over and over again. Stanley Kubrick never felt bad about running hundreds of takes because, well, in his mind, that was the job. He didn't care if it meant burning through time or film stock. His view was pretty simple. Painters have pencils and sketch pads. Directors have film and time. Those are his tools, so if he needed 70 takes of a hallway shot or 3 days to shoot someone walking across a room, he was going to take them. Every frame had to be right. Not good enough, but right. Cruise and Nicole Kidman, his then wife, knew what they were signing up for. But what they probably didn't expect was to spend 2 years filming what was originally pitched as a 6-month job. At the time, Cruise was in his prime, raking in $20 million per film. He could have knocked out 2, maybe 3 blockbusters during that same stretch. Instead, he spent those years opening doors. That was Kubrick in a nutshell. If you were on his set, even the way you crossed a room had to be just right. And if you weren't ready to live in that pressure cooker, well, you probably shouldn't have asked how to walk in the first place. However, Cruise paid a heavy price for it. He walked away with an ulcer and possibly a broken marriage. He and Kidman divorced not long after the shoot wrapped. The stress, the exhaustion, the emotional toll, it all played a part. Unlike The Shining, where Shelley Duvall's suffering at least fed into a performance that became legendary, Eyes Wide Shut didn't quite land the same way. It didn't kill at the box office, and the critics were on the fence. To top it off, this ended up being Kubrick's last film. He died on March 7, 1999 from a complication after a car accident before the movie's full release. That made Eyes Wide Shut the final chapter of his legacy. A film that drained its stars, outlasted its schedule, and left behind more questions than praise. It wasn't a clean victory, and there was no sense of worth it in the way The Shining eventually earned. It felt like a director chasing perfection until the end, while his cast quietly unraveled in the process. Even early in his career, Stanley Kubrick was already tormenting actors. During the filming of 1957's Paths of Glory, his perfectionist streak was on full display. Kirk Douglas was the star, but it was veteran actor Adolphe Menjou who ended up on the receiving end of Kubrick's now famous demand for endless takes. Kubrick had Menjou redo the same scene 17 times, and not because the performance was bad, because Menjou was a seasoned pro, but Kubrick wanted something hyper-specific. On take 17, Menjou figured he'd nailed it. He called for lunch, probably assuming the director would agree. He didn't, and Kubrick asked for another. That's when Menjou was furious. In front of the whole cast and crew, he let loose. He yelled, cursed, and absolutely went berserk on Kubrick, expecting some kind of reaction. But Kubrick didn't flinch. Instead, he just sat there, calm and stone-faced, waited for Menjou to finish, and then said, "All right, let's try the scene once more." And that was it. Menjou, a man who didn't take orders lightly, went right back to work without another word. It was a moment that showed how Kubrick operated. He didn't care if you were a star, a veteran, or furious. If he didn't have what he wanted, you were doing it again. And most of the time, you did. He stripped on set to maintain power dynamics. Back when One-Eyed Jacks was in the works in 1961, things got weird behind the scenes, and Marlon Brando was directing, starring, and holding court right out of his own home. And he had one rule for anyone stepping inside: shoes off. Stanley Kubrick, who was working on the project early on before eventually being replaced, took things in a whole other direction. Forget shoes, he ditched his pants. Kubrick would be on set or at Brando's place wearing a button-down shirt up top and boxers below. Just walking around like that was totally normal. Apparently, that was his creative comfort zone. Shirt, briefs, and a camera. It wasn't a prank or some rebellious statement. It kept Kubrick hyper-focused, ultra-precise, and completely unbothered by what anyone else thought. If pants got in the way of his concentration, well, off they went. However, it made the cast and crew off balance, uncomfortable, and super aware of him. Kubrick didn't stay on the project long, but stories like this stuck, because this is Kubrick. Of course he directed his underwear, if that's what helped him focus. It just makes perfect sense. The hedge maze dilemma. Stanley Kubrick had an obsession with detail, and when it came to The Shining, that obsession led him straight into a maze, quite literally. He wanted the hedge maze to do more than just look creepy. It also had to feel like a physical version of Jack Torrance's unraveling mind, something that felt endless, suffocating, and impossible to beat. So, the production team built one. The problem was, it was only about 2/3 the size of what would appear on film, and Kubrick worried it might be too easy to solve. The crew, feeling a bit cheeky, dared him to try it one Saturday morning. He took the challenge and got lost. After a while, he gave up. The crew loved it, because for once, Kubrick was the one who couldn't find the exit. But he wasn't the only one struggling. That maze was almost impossible. To shoot the scene where Jack chases Danny through the hedges, the crew dumped around 900 tons of salt and crushed styrofoam to fake the snow. It looked amazing, but it made the place harder to navigate. The set was hot, claustrophobic, and easy to get get turned around in. Crew members kept disappearing behind corners and had to use walkie-talkies to find each other. It took over a month to get that one sequence in the can. FYI, if you go back to the scene where Jack is at the job interview, take a look at his tie. It mirrors the layout of the hedge maze. That's detailing to the T. All work and no play wasn't random. Stanley Kubrick obsessed over every tiny thing you see on screen. Take that infamous reveal in The Shining, where Wendy flips through Jack's novel and discovers 500 pages filled with nothing but one repeating line. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Page after page, just the same phrase, typed again and again. Now, if Kubrick had filmed that scene today, it'd be a quick copy-paste job, done in an hour. But in 1980, there were no laptops or shortcuts. It was all typed on a typewriter. And Kubrick, of course, wanted every page to look real, like Jack had actually sat down and typed every one of them during his long, slow spiral into madness. So, Kubrick's assistant was given this mundane task. She spent months typing the same sentence over and over. Every sheet was typed by hand, so it wouldn't look like a reprint. And the craziest thing is that she had to do it again in 3 different languages for the international versions of the film. And remember, these pages had to survive or be destroyed across dozens of takes. Shelley Duvall tears them apart in multiple versions of that scene. That meant backups. More pages, more typing, all for a moment that lasts maybe 2 minutes on screen. But that's how Kubrick worked. He hired people who wouldn't flinch at the impossible, and they delivered. He once dared an actor to have a limb removed, for effect. While working on Barry Lyndon, Stanley Kubrick needed a one-legged soldier for a quick background shot. The problem was, casting didn't come through. Most directors would rewrite the shot, cut around it, or find a camera trick to fake it. But this was Kubrick we're talking about, so naturally, he took things too far. He turned to his lead actor, Ryan O'Neal, and tossed out a random suggestion. He asked, dead serious, if he'd be willing to get his leg chopped off. Seriously. That was the solution Kubrick floated for a throwaway shot, all for the sake of realism. Kubrick said it was a joke, supposedly. But when the same guy made Shelley Duvall swing a bat 127 times until she nearly collapsed and told Tom Cruise to walk through a doorway about 95 times, you start to wonder if he really was joking. With Kubrick, you never quite knew where the line was. Maybe it was a joke, maybe not. After all, Kubrick didn't play by normal rules. Naturally, O'Neal didn't sign up to become the world's first method actor amputee, and the role went to an actual one-legged man. But the fact that Kubrick even had the idea like it was totally normal says a lot about how his brain worked. And we're not surprised, because with Kubrick, nothing ever fell off the table. He secretly used warm-up takes in the final cut. As funny as George C. Scott is in Dr. Strangelove, he wasn't exactly thrilled about playing it like a live-action cartoon. He wanted to keep things sharp, intense, maybe even a little grounded. But Kubrick had other ideas. He asked Scott to go big and goofy for the warm-up takes before the real takes. Scott agreed, but only under the condition that the footage wouldn't be used. Silly faces, exaggerated lines, and that infamous stumble where he loses his balance and springs right back up like nothing happened. None of it was supposed to be in the movie, but Kubrick quietly rolled the cameras on the warm-ups and used them as the final takes. When Scott found out those warm-ups were what made the cut, he was infuriated. He felt blindsided and thought Kubrick had tricked him into clowning around on camera, only to make him look ridiculous in front of the whole world. And no matter how iconic the final performance turned out, Scott didn't find any of it charming. He felt betrayed enough to swear off working with Kubrick ever again, and he didn't. While the larger-than-life, almost cartoonish general made Dr. Strangelove the dark comedy classic it is, it also marked the end of that collaboration. Kubrick got the absurdity he wanted, but Scott was immortalized for a version of the role he never meant to give. He destroyed or buried earlier works he deemed imperfect. Even Stanley Kubrick's first movie wasn't safe from Stanley Kubrick. The 1953 Fear and Desire was his feature debut, a small war drama. Now, most filmmakers would be proud just to have finished a movie, not Kubrick. He treated it like a stain on his elaborate resume. The second he got the clout, he went on a mission to wipe it off the map. He tracked down every reel he could get his hands on, snatched them up, destroyed them, and blocked any public screenings. He hated it that much and called it amateur work, said it was clumsy and embarrassing. He didn't want people to see his early growing pains. He only wanted his best work to be remembered, and even that had to meet a standard. When people asked him why he pushed everything to the limit, he gave an answer that sounded more like battlefield strategy than filmmaking. In his mind, if you're leading something big, you control every move. You don't show up late. You don't miss your mark. You hit the right frame, on the right day, with the right tone, or you do it again. So, Fear and Desire got buried. Kubrick never forgot it, but he sure made sure nobody else would see it. That was the beginning, and already he was aiming higher than most directors even dream about. He spent years refining, even choosing the perfect cloud. For Stanley Kubrick, nothing was too small, too trivial, or too much to obsess over. Case in point, The Shining. You know that opening scene where the camera floats over the lake, creeping toward the mountains as Jack drives to the Overlook Hotel? Gorgeous shot, right? Yeah, but what you probably didn't know is that Kubrick lost years of his life tweaking it. And it wasn't even about the camera work. It was the clouds. Yeah, the clouds. You know, he didn't like the clouds. The shapes weren't right and the lighting was So he started scanning through reels and reels of aerial footage, hunting for a single shot where the clouds looked the way he pictured them in his head. It had to feel heavy, but not stormy. Real, but weirdly wrong. Now, a regular director might have shrugged it off. It's nature, they'd say. Clouds are clouds. But Kubrick treated clouds like actors. If they didn't perform the way he wanted, they got cut. He kept at it for years, sifting through thousands of frames to lock down the perfect slice of sky. Eventually, he found it, a specific cloud formation that floated just right across the mountaintops. If Kubrick had gone with any random cloud, I highly doubt any of us would have noticed that. Because first, it's a cloud, and second, it's a cloud man. But this is Kubrick we're talking about. And for him, everything mattered, even a passing cloud in an intro shot that barely lasts a few seconds. But this obsession with everything to look exactly right on camera really boiled over in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Rumor has it that he personally examined over 2,000 chairs before picking one for a single shot. Because in Kubrick's world, even the chair in the corner of the frame needed to feel like it came from decades ahead. If something looked off, he'd scrap it and start over. And he'd keep doing that until everyone on set was too tired to argue. The set designer from 2001 once admitted that although they formed a tight bond, the job pushed him so far that he later said he needed tranquilizers to get through it. No kidding. Kubrick could have that effect on people. He riveted audiences with the chilling Kubrick stare. You've seen it, even if you didn't know it had a name. That dead serious face with the chin tilted low, eyes locked up, brows stiff, pupils wide, looking like they're seconds from snapping. That's the Kubrick stare, and it's all over his films. And once you spot it, you can't unsee it. Kubrick used it in almost all his films. Jack Nicholson had it in The Shining, wide-eyed, maniacal. In Full Metal Jacket, Private Pyle gives it while holding a loaded rifle in a bathroom. Even Alex in A Clockwork Orange does it with a creepy grin right before smashing a bottle in someone's face. It shows up when a character's gone off the deep end, when they fully snapped or are about to. It was that look before the violence. Kubrick made his actors rehearse it until the expression wasn't acting anymore. And now it's everywhere. People reference it in memes, posters, and even other movies. It turned into visual shorthand for "this person's not okay." But the real reason it works is because Kubrick didn't treat it like a gimmick. It came from a place of real tension, moments where the characters stopped being fictional and started looking too real. One glare, and you know something's off. He used thousands of records to find a single piece of music. In the script for Barry Lyndon, the final duel is summed up in one line. Barry duels with Lord Bullingdon. On paper, it sounds simple, but when has Kubrick ever gone for simple? That one line turned into 42 full working days in the editing room, all because he was deep in a music rabbit hole, digging through every Baroque and classical piece from the 17th and 18th centuries. He wanted a track that matched the tone, the tempo, the tension, something that didn't just sit behind the scenes but pulled you into it. And of course, it had to be period accurate. And so, he personally combed through hundreds of recordings, cycling through composers, comparing tempos, rewinding, rejecting, and starting all over again. That search eventually led him to Handel's Sarabande, which ended up scoring the scene with a grim, elegant weight that's hard to shake. That duel scene became one of the film's most powerful moments. It was 42 days of complete obsession after all, and behind every pause and every note was a director who would listen to everything before deciding what would play when the guns came out. He used so much fake blood the town's gutters ran red. A lot of people see The Shining as more than a haunted hotel story. Strip it down, and yes, it's about a guy who takes a job as winter caretaker, gets cabin fever, and loses his mind. But when we dig deeper, the film is loaded with subtext. Plenty of film scholars and die-hard fans believe Kubrick was using the Overlook Hotel as a stand-in for bigger horrors, specifically genocide, the Holocaust, the mass killing of Native Americans. That theory gets a boost from a small line added by Kubrick himself. When Ullman, the hotel's general manager, gives Jack the tour, he mentions that the Overlook was built on an Indian burial ground. That detail doesn't show up in Stephen King's book, but Kubrick planted it there, and it changes everything. If you take it literally, that means the hotel's builders had to dig through graves to put in something like, say, an elevator shaft. And what's the one image that keeps haunting Danny? Floods of blood pouring out of the elevators. Speaking of blood, Kubrick used so much fake blood while filming that iconic hallway scene that the nearby village of Borehamwood had red-stained gutters. Gallons upon gallons of thick red liquid flowing into the drains outside the studio. That's the length Kubrick went to for his craft. So, whether or not Kubrick meant for the film to be about genocide, it's hard to unsee it once you start connecting the dots. And like most things Kubrick, it's both right in your face and hidden in plain sight. He demanded green in a black and white film. In 1964, Dr. Strangelove, Kubrick turned nuclear strategy into a darkly absurd poker game. One of the most iconic sets in the film is the War Room, a giant circular table, harsh lighting overhead, military brass plotting the end of the world. But there's a detail most people never knew and wouldn't even see. That massive table we see, Kubrick insisted, be covered in green felt. Specifically, poker table green. Now, the movie was in black and white. No one watching the film would ever know what color the table was. But that didn't matter to Kubrick. He wanted the cast to feel like they were sitting at a high-stakes gambling table, betting with lives instead of chips. To him, that little detail helped lock in the mood, even if it never showed up on screen. Obviously, the production crew pushed back. Why waste time and money covering a giant table in poker felt if the audience couldn't tell? But Kubrick was adamant. He didn't care if we saw it, the actors would know. And that would shape how they moved, how they sat, how they played the scene. That was the point. He didn't need the audience to notice the green. He needed the actors to feel like they were gambling with the fate of humanity. And somehow, that ridiculous invisible poker table made it real. Kubrick and King hated each other's versions. Legend has it that when Kubrick got his hands on Stephen King's The Shining, he knew right away that this was going to be his first horror film. But Kubrick being Kubrick, he didn't grab the first spooky book off a shelf and call it a day. He locked himself inside his massive library and tore through book after book. And when he didn't like one, his secretary could hear the sound of it slamming against the wall. That was his way of saying no thanks. One day, though, the silence was suspicious. She walked in and found Kubrick deep into The Shining, eyes locked, completely pulled in. That was the book that passed the test. He paid Stephen King an undisclosed sum for the rights and started building his vision. King wrote a draft of the script, hoping to keep it close to his novel, but Kubrick wasn't impressed and tossed it aside. According to most accounts, he didn't even bother to read it, and instead of King, he teamed up with Diane Johnson, an American novelist who had written The Shadow Knows, a gothic mystery he really liked. Together, they reworked the story into something moodier and more ambiguous, less about ghosts and more about madness. That didn't sit well with King. For years, he tore into Kubrick's film, saying it looked great but felt empty. He never hid how much he hated Stanley Kubrick's take on The Shining. He hated the changes to Jack's character, and while the film has been praised for its haunting visuals and surreal tone, King thought Kubrick stripped the heart out of the book and turned it into an art piece that forgot to be scary. For King, The Shining is about a supernatural force, the Overlook Hotel, slowly corrupting a man. But Kubrick, a man famously skeptical of anything mystical, saw it more as a psychological spiral. To him, the horror came from inside Jack, not from the haunted walls around him. King later told film historian Laurent Bouzereau that this was the film's fatal flaw. Because Kubrick didn't believe in the idea of supernatural evil, he couldn't portray it in a way that felt real. For years, he didn't let Kubrick off easy. He called him a man who thought too much and felt too little. Someone who could craft a stunning frame but never really hit the gut-level terror that horror needs. The film looked great, but King felt it didn't grip the audience by the throat the way true horror should. And yeah, maybe that's fair, depending on what kind of horror you're into. But Kubrick didn't make The Shining to please the author. He made it to haunt the viewer, and whether King liked it or not, it worked. The film became a classic and remains the one that still messes with people's heads decades later. Marvelous verdict. Working with Stanley Kubrick sure sounds like something I'd have loved to watch from a distance. I love the films, don't get me wrong, but the dude didn't care if you were tired, bruised, hoarse, or emotionally wrecked. If he wanted the shot, he got the shot even after a million takes. True, the final products were masterpieces, but they were all built on blood, sweat, and 100 takes of the same damn line. And by the end, everyone involved was either traumatized or part of cinematic history, or both. So yeah, after going through all that, I get why people said working with Kubrick felt less like making a movie and more like surviving one. And now, I honestly don't know whether I admire the guy or need therapy after talking about him, probably both. But one thing's clear. Kubrick didn't care if you liked him. He wasn't there to hold hands or hand out compliments. He was there to make sure what ended up in the frame felt real, even if it broke you in the process. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.